Right, let's put up our fence. We're going to fence in this direction, which I'll indicate with this fiberglass shaft, so that you can once again see the relationship between the stay and anchor tread-ins of the end assembly. Also, we'd normally be setting the end assembly up against an existing fence, which I'll represent with this polywire here. Once I've set the end assembly, I'll pin it down so that you get a better view of what's going on. First step, we need to unlock the clamp on the rack, take out our first end assembly tread-ins, lock the rack again, and lay the pack down on its front, pointing in the direction that we're going to be putting up our fence. Once again, assemble the end assembly, the anchor post angling back about 10 degrees. Again, allowing for a travel on the pin, and the stay set out about 10 centimetres to the right. In a more upright position and down to the left. Right, now to the trickier business of wiring up the release hook. Through the polywire through the guide on the beef pack, bring it up to the release hook, and leaving yourself quite a generous tail, follow the instructions that are engraved on the top of the lugs. 1 through here, 2, 3 through the middle and round the back, and when you come to 4 it says 4 on top. That means this time the polywire comes around, bring it above the polywire that's already there, not underneath, above. And 5 is through the gap again, behind this little lug and out to the front. If I give some pull release sequences, you can see that the tail of the polywire gets dragged through, but if I pull it tight, it locks. If we leave a tail of about that length, when we come to dismantle our fence, we go to the spool end and give a series of pulls, and bingo, the free end of our temporary fence is released. Wire it up again. As polywire gets old, it's a bit harder to pull through, so you need to leave a shorter tail. But in this case, about there is right. We go over, pick up the beef pack with our right hand, and once again cradle it on our left forearm. Note that we've got the crank in the approximately 10 o'clock position, and just a little bit of drag on the spool. Too much drag and it's too tricky to clip onto the polywire, and it's also wear the chuck out more quickly. Once again, we want to face our destination, choosing a specific target so that we can keep a straight line. And it's a big help, again, as with the dairy pack, if we can clip onto the polywire without looking at what we are doing. We'll go through the drill again. Grab the first tread in about 10 to 15 centimetres down below the clip, start moving towards your target, point the tread in out in the direction of 2 o'clock with the pedal hanging down, scoop the shaft and clip under the polywire, bring it up towards my chin, push out, clockwise turn, anti-clockwise turn. Without changing your grip on the tread-in, plant it in the ground. Again, out, under, up, out, turn, turn. Keeping our eyes on the target and moving throughout the operation. See how I'm clipping onto the polywire without looking at what I'm doing, keeping my eyes on the target. Also note that I'm taking the tread-ins out of the front of the rack first, to leave my tread-in assembly posts free for when I get to the end. When we get to about within 4 metres of the end of the fence, we want to unload the spool. So we unwind the chuck adjusting nut back to its stop, taking care not to go past that stop. Snap the polywire out of the guide and snap the spool off the chuck by pushing on both sides with your hand and your leg. If you just push on one side, it tends not to want to move. Take the end assembly tread-ins out of the rack and construct the end assembly just as we've done previously. One point to note is that if you hit a stone or the steel pin and fiberglass start to splay, take it out and do it again. The pedal will take on a permanent set if they're splayed, and will tend to do the splits from there on after. Take the spool and running it through your fingers to gauge the tension, snap the spool onto the buttons on the release hook. Don't over tension the poly wire, it won't be any more effective as a barrier, it'll be more prone to breakage, and the release hook won't be as effective. Have it just tight enough to take any slackness out of the poly wire. Right, that's our fence put up. I could now take my beef pack and deal with another fence on the farm, but let's take this one down. We snap the spool off the release hook by pushing on the buttons with the 2 fingers. We're now going to activate the release hook at the far end of the fence. The best technique to do this is to take the spool in our left hand, grab the poly wire with our right, making sure there's a good bit of slack between both our hands, maybe even tuck the spool behind us to keep it out of the way. With our right arm extended out in front of us, adjust our position with our feet until there's just a little bit of slack in the poly wire ahead. Our pull release sequence will be a little bit dictated to by the length of the fence, but basically we want to do as long a pull and as fast as possible, and pausing for a split second with our hand out in front, and we can feel the shock wave hit at the far end of the fence. And there we have it released. Make that action as much of a whiplash as you can. Pop the spool onto the winder, making sure that the poly wire is feeding in from the top, and put it into the guide. To remember that, a good call is behind the loop and over the end. This time we want to lock the spool onto the chuck. So making sure that our spindle lock is on, we wind the chuck up, and especially as we get to the end, hold the spool firm. There, that's our spool firmly attached to the chuck. Unlock the spindle lock, and tucking the rack under our arm to keep it firm, we can wind in the poly wire. We can wind at a moderate speed, but not over fast, because we run the risk of the poly wire getting caught around a tread-in. We also move the rack from side to side to feed the poly wire evenly onto the spool. If the poly wire does catch around a tread-in, don't keep winding on the crank handle. Reach forward and pull the poly wire directly. Remember, it's a winder, not a winch. As we get towards the end of winding up the poly wire, one trick is to run the poly wire round behind the end assembly, just to add a little bit more friction. We get to the end, to secure the poly wire, tuck it down the side of the spool. It's a good habit to get into to set your winder up for your next fence, which means setting the crank in the approximately 10 o'clock position again, and adjusting the chuck nut for that little bit of frictional braking that we need. With a little bit of practice, we can disassemble our end assembly with one hand. But remember, put your foot against the anchor tread-in to stop it bouncing back, and it may cause injury. Tipping your right hand over and cradling the clip, push down and twist, and you can snap the stay post off the anchor post. Remembering to put the anchor tread-in into the rack first, we're going to load the tread-ins as we saw earlier.